There are movies that succeed upon release and then gradually fade into oblivion. But there are also movies whose value grows greater as time passes. The Shawshank Redemption is exactly such a special case. The interesting thing is that in 1994, no one thought this movie would become a legend. It was not the biggest box office hit. It did not possess epic action scenes or effects that overwhelmed the audience. Yet more than 30 years later, millions of people still return to watch the story of Andy Dufresne and read like meeting old friends again. Perhaps because Shawshank has never been just a movie about a prison. It is a story about hope when everything seems to have ended, about human dignity in the darkest places, and about the belief that no matter how long life imprisons us, there always exists a path leading to freedom. But behind that masterpiece hides countless stories that few people know. From casting decisions that almost changed the entire history of the film, embedded details that most audiences have never noticed, to behind-the-scenes truths that make you look at Shawshank in a completely different way. Today, we will explore the 20 most surprising facts about the Shawshank Redemption. Stories that prove that sometimes, the most magical thing about a movie lies in what happens behind the screen. 1. The ASPCA and a suddenly deceased maggot. If there is any detail that clearly shows Hollywood is sometimes unbelievably strange, this is probably the #1 candidate. In the scene where Brooks gently feeds Jake the Crow a maggot, it was supposed to be just a moment lasting a few seconds on screen. But behind those few seconds is a story that makes many people laugh when they first hear it. The animal rights representative present on set objected to the use of a live maggot. According to their regulations, even such a tiny creature must be treated humanely. As a result, the film crew had to go find a maggot that had died of natural causes before being allowed to continue filming. Honestly speaking, every time I hear this story, I feel it is very Shawshank. Not because of the prison or the jailbreak, but because it reminds us that the movie is made up of countless small details that the audience never sees. And think about it. If you were a director in 1993, would you ever imagine that the whole film crew had to pause their work just to find a legally deceased maggot? That is exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes story that makes classic movies more memorable over the years. 2. The 500-yard waste pipe was actually very delicious. For many fans, this is not only the most memorable scene of the Shawshank Redemption, but also one of the most iconic moments in cinematic history. Andy Dufresne crawled through a pipe hundreds of yards long, filled with waste in exchange for freedom. Just hearing the description is enough to make one shudder. But the interesting thing is that cinema always has a way of deceiving us. The thick black liquid that Tim Robbins had to soak himself in for many hours was actually created from a mixture of chocolate syrup, sawdust, and water. In other words, the most terrible-looking thing in the movie smelled more like a kitchen than a sewer system. What I like about this story does not lie in the mixing formula, but in the power of filmmaking art. We know those are just props. We know it is not real waste. Yet every time I watch it again, I still feel the suffocation, desperation, and the sense of release when Andy crawls out of the other end. Is anyone like me? Even though I have known this behind-the-scenes secret for many years, every time that scene comes up, my brain still completely believes that Andy has just gone through the most terrible thing in his life. That is the magic that great movies sometimes create. 3. The $5,000 check that was never cashed by Stephen King. Of all the behind-the-scenes stories of the Shawshank Redemption, this is probably the one that makes me smile the most. Not because it is funny or shocking, but because it reminds us that behind great movies are often very sincere relationships between people. When Frank Darabont was still a young director looking for an opportunity to prove himself, Stephen King sold the rights to the short story Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption to him for only $5,000. Even at that time, this was not a large amount of money for a famous author like King. But the more wonderful thing is that he never cashed that check. After the movie became a legend, King framed the check and sent it back to Darabont with a message: "In case you need bail money to get out of jail." Every time I read this story, I feel it reflects the spirit of Shawshank in a strange way. The movie is about trust, given to others even when the future is very bleak. And it seems Stephen King gave Frank Darabont that very trust very early on. What do you think? In an era where everything is often measured by revenue and contracts, are stories like this becoming increasingly rare? 4. Morgan Freeman threw a baseball for 9 straight hours to the point of injury. If one had to choose a scene that seems the simplest in the Shawshank Redemption, I think many people would mention the first conversation between Red and Andy in the prison yard. There are no explosions, no breathtaking climaxes, just two men talking while one tosses a baseball back and forth very naturally. But it is exactly those seemingly simple scenes that sometimes require the most effort. To get a few short minutes on screen, Morgan Freeman had to repeat the throwing motion for almost 9 hours. What impresses me is not that his arm hurt afterward. What makes me admire him is that he did not complain at all during the filming process. The next day, Freeman showed up with his arm bandaged and in a sling. Hearing this story, I suddenly remember a thing that audiences often forget. Great performances rarely come from ease. Perhaps that is also the reason the character Red brings such an authentic feeling. Because behind the calmness on screen is an actor willing to endure discomfort to get every smallest detail right. And sometimes, it is exactly those small details that create a legend. 5. The joking line, "Maybe it is because I am Irish," was not a random script choice. This is one of the shortest lines in the film, but also one of the smartest. When Andy asked why people called him Red, Morgan Freeman calmly replied, "Maybe it is because I am Irish." The first time hearing it, most audiences laughed. It is a very gentle, very natural type of humor. Not trying to be funny, but extremely effective. The interesting thing is that statement was not random at all. In the original story by Stephen King, Red is actually a white man of Irish descent with reddish hair. When Morgan Freeman was cast in the role, the character completely changed in appearance. But Frank Darabont decided to keep this line as a discreet greeting sent to longtime readers. Personally, I really like details like that. They do not change the plot. If you have never read the book, you will still understand and smile. But if you know its origin, the line suddenly becomes much more interesting. That is also what I always love about Shawshank. The movie never shows off its intelligence. It just quietly places small gifts along the way and lets the audience discover them on their own over the years. 6. The criminal record of Red was actually a picture of the son of Morgan Freeman. One of the things I like most about classic movies is that sometimes very small details bring incredibly warm behind-the-scenes stories, and this is exactly such an example. If you pay close attention during the scenes where the parole board reviews the file of Red, you will see his mugshot from when he was young. Many people think it is an edited photo or an actor cast specifically to look like Morgan Freeman. But no. The person in that picture is Alfonso Freeman, his biological son. An even more interesting thing is that Alfonso does not just appear in the photo, he also has a very short role at the beginning of the film. He is the prisoner who shouts the phrase, fresh fish today," when the new prisoners, including Andy, first set foot in Shawshank. I always feel that details like that make a movie more relatable. Behind the story of a prison, hope, and redemption, there are still very everyday moments of a father and a son participating together in a lifetime masterpiece. And honestly speaking, how many of us have watched Shawshank many times without ever realizing that? That is exactly the reason great movies always reward those who return to explore them once more. 7. Tom Cruise, Tom Hanks, and Brad Pitt almost stole the spotlight. This is one of the behind-the-scenes facts that always makes me stop for a few seconds to think. Try to imagine a version of The Shawshank Redemption with Tom Cruise, Tom Hanks, or Kevin Costner. It sounds appealing, but would it still be the movie we have loved for over 3 decades? The most noteworthy thing here is not the names that turned down the roles. The noteworthy thing is that Frank Darabont turned down a life-changing opportunity. When Rob Reiner offered to buy the script for $2.5 million, that was an amount of money that could completely change the life of a young director. But Darabont believed that he had to be the one to tell this story his own way. Looking back today, it is hard to say he was wrong. Personally, I always think Tim Robbins brings a very special normality to Andy. He does not appear as a movie superstar. He appears as a real man trapped in an inescapable situation. Perhaps that is exactly what makes the journey of Andy more relatable. What about you? If you could turn back time, would you want to see Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks in the role of Andy? Or do you still believe that Tim Robbins was the most perfect choice? 8. The extremely clever solution hidden in the Bible. This is the type of detail that makes me believe The Shawshank Redemption was not only written with talent, but also with an almost obsessive care. Because if you blink, you will miss it. But when you discover it, you will never look at the movie the same way again. Everyone remembers the famous quote of Warden Norton, "Salvation lies within." He always carries the Bible as a symbol of morality and faith. Ironically, right inside that very Bible is where Andy hid the tiny rock hammer, the tool that paved the way for the greatest escape in cinematic history. But what excites me the most is the location of the hammer. It was carved right into the beginning of the book of Exodus. For those familiar with the Bible, Exodus is the story of liberation, of leaving slavery to seek freedom. It is hard to believe, right? A prison movie hides its entire central theme in a few pages of a book that most audiences never notice. And perhaps that is why Shawshank is still mentioned after many decades. Because every time we watch it again, the movie always seems to whisper to us a new secret that we accidentally forgot last time. 9. Many actresses sent casting photos due to misunderstanding the movie title. This is probably one of the most interesting misunderstandings in Hollywood history. If you put yourself in the position of a young actress in the early 1990s and saw a casting notice for a project called Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, I can also understand why many people would think this was a movie about Rita Hayworth. And so the casting office started receiving a series of profiles from actresses and models. The only problem is, the movie has almost no significant female roles at all. Every time I hear this story, I feel it reflects a very interesting part of Hollywood before the internet era. Today, with just a few clicks, people can know the content of a project. But in those years, sometimes just a name was enough to create a series of hilarious misunderstandings. What makes me think more than anything is the fact that the movie was eventually renamed The Shawshank Redemption. Honestly speaking, this is not an easy name to remember or sell tickets. Many studio executives even worried that audiences would not know how to pronounce the word Shawshank. Yet, miraculously, today it is one of the most famous names in cinematic history. Sometimes the value of a movie does not lie in how appealing the name sounds, but in the emotion it leaves behind after the screen turns off. 10. The historical deception, the movie was once a box office bomb. It is hard to believe when thinking that a movie considered a masterpiece today once started as a deception at the box office. But that is exactly the initial fate of The Shawshank Redemption. When it first premiered, the movie only grossed about $16 million, while the production budget was up to $25 million. With those numbers, Hollywood at that time considered this a clear failure. No one wanted to spend money to watch a prison movie with a long, hard-to-remember name and almost no obvious commercial elements. But what numbers cannot measure is time. When the film was released on VHS and later re-aired on cable television, especially TNT, things began to change. Audiences watched not because of heavy advertising, but because they stumbled upon it on a quiet evening. And then they stayed. Not for a few minutes, but for the entire movie. I always find this very interesting. There are works not born to shine immediately. They need time, need the right circumstances, and most importantly, need the right viewer at the right moment of their life. Have you ever watched Shawshank for the first time, not in a theater, but on TV or an old VHS tape? Perhaps that very accidental experience is the reason this movie has lived so long. 11. The director did not want the ending on Zihuatanejo Beach at all. There are endings in cinema that only truly exist because of a debate between art and the market. The Shawshank Redemption is a prime example. Frank Darabont initially did not want the Zihuatanejo beach scene at all. In the first version, he intended to end the film at the moment Red sat on the bus, looking forward, with no explanation, no certainty. An open ending, true to real life, but also much colder and lonelier. Castle Rock Studio thought differently. They wanted the audience to have an emotional anchor, an image of reunion. And finally, they convinced Darabont to shoot an extra scene of Red and Andy meeting again on the sunlit beach. The interesting thing is that Darabont later admitted he did not like being forced to change at all. But looking back, he said a very true sentence: they were right. I think this is a rare moment Hollywood let emotion lead the way instead of logic. And do you see, if it were not for that beach, would Shawshank still make us feel so relieved? 12. The stream Andy jumped into was actually extremely toxic. The scene of Andy stepping out of the pipe and standing in the rain is one of the most iconic moments in cinematic history. But few people know that victory took place in a not very safe location. The stream in Ohio, where this scene was filmed, was actually warned to have a high level of pollution. Local experts had advised the film crew not to let the actors soak for too long. But to get the most real emotion, Tim Robbins still performed the scene almost without hesitation. I always think about this every time I watch it again. We often see a brilliant moment of freedom on screen, but rarely think about the real price behind it. Right after the director called cut, Robbins was immediately taken for a hot shower and disinfection. A small detail, but it makes the movie scene more real in a very strange way. Has anyone else ever felt that the moment Andy raised his hands to the sky in the rain was like a liberation not only of the character, but of the entire film crew? 13. The inspiration from the gangsters of Goodfellas. One thing that makes the Shawshank Redemption so strangely smooth is the narration voice of Red. It not only guides the story, but also creates the feeling like we are listening to an old friend recount the memories of his life. What few people know is that Frank Darabont took a lot of inspiration from Goodfellas by Martin Scorsese. During the filming process, he often rewatched that movie every weekend to learn how to use voiceovers naturally, without being forced. I think this explains a lot. The narration of Red never tries to impress. It is deep, steady, and sometimes pauses at the right place, like a person who has lived long enough to not need to prove anything anymore. Perhaps that is why when Red talks about Andy, we do not feel like we are listening to a movie story, but rather listening to the real memories of a person. Do you notice? Very few movies today can use voiceovers without making the audience feel overly guided like Shawshank did. 14. Do not expect me to behave like a real prison guard. The character Byron Hadley is one of the most powerful and terrifying figures in Shawshank. But the interesting thing lies in the person behind that role. Clancy Brown, who played Hadley, was once invited by many real former prison guards to be an advisor to help him portray the character more authentically, but he refused them all. The reason of Brown was not out of arrogance, but because he felt Hadley was too cruel a character. He did not want contact with real-life people to accidentally make him change his view of them or blur the line between acting and real life. I have to admit, this makes me look at him differently. In a movie full of characters engulfed in darkness, there is an actor who chooses to keep a clear moral boundary for himself. Perhaps that very contrast makes Hadley on screen more terrifying. Because behind that brutality is an actor very conscious of his true self. What do you think? Should a villain role be studied too deeply from real life? 15. The legendary oak tree is now gone. Cinematic icons sometimes not only live in movies, but also exist in real life. The oak tree in Shawshank is such an example. That is where Andy buried the tin box he left for Red, and also a place associated with one of the most beautiful promises of the movie. The oak tree in Mansfield, Ohio, became a pilgrimage site for fans for many years. But time always has its way. In 2011, the tree was struck by lightning and cracked. And by 2016, strong winds finally knocked it down completely. What touches me is that afterward, many fans collected the remaining wood to make small souvenirs, as if they did not want that memory to disappear completely. I think this is a very special thing about Shawshank. It not only lives in the movie, but also lives in the way people try to hold on to what they love in real life. Have you ever visited a movie location and felt like you were stepping into the memories of the film? 16. The stone wall had to be built from several months in advance. There are details in the movie that audiences almost never think about until they hear the behind the scenes. The stone wall near the base of the oak tree is one of them. It was not an existing natural setting. The production design team had to stack each stone by hand, with almost extreme patience, from several months before the cameras started rolling. The goal was not just to look beautiful, but to let time do the rest of the work. Weeds grew, moss clung to every crevice of the stones, and gradually, that artificial thing turned into a part of nature that the audience believed had always existed. I am always obsessed with that kind of work in cinema. It is not glamorous, it has no spotlight, but it determines the real or fake feeling of an entire movie scene. Do you notice? The things that look the most natural in movies are often the most meticulously built. 17. Mansfield Prison was almost leveled. One of the strangest things about Shawshank is that the filming location itself might not exist today if it were not for this movie. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield was once scheduled to be demolished after closing in 1990. This place was considered seriously degraded, no longer of use value. But then the Shawshank film crew appeared. They chose this place as the main setting, turning the old walls into a part of the story about hope and redemption. What no one expected was that after the movie premiered, this location was no longer demolished. Instead, it was preserved and became a museum, a tourist destination attracting fans from all over the world. I always think this is one of the most beautiful real endings in cinema. Not only were the characters saved, but a real-life building was also saved. Have you ever been to a filming location and felt it still breathing with the story? 18. What is the opera song actually? One of the most memorable scenes in Shawshank is when Andy plays opera music through the prison speaker system. It is a moment that makes the entire space seem to stop. Red said at that time that he did not know what the two Italian women in the music were singing about. But the music itself transcended language, transcended the prison walls, and touched every person. The interesting thing is that the piece of music is sole aria from The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. The content revolves around a fake love letter to expose betrayal. It does not talk about freedom in a direct sense, but carries a very strong emotional release. I think this is one of the most beautiful moments of the film, not because it is loud, but because it makes the whole prison quiet. Have you ever heard a piece of music that makes you forget where you are? 19. Number 237. The Obsession of Stephen King. Stephen King always has very discreet ways to connect his works, and Shawshank is no exception. When Red finally entered the hotel after being paroled, he stayed in room number 237. To normal audiences, it is just a random number. But to fans of Stephen King, it is almost a chilling reminder. In The Shining, room 237 is the iconic room of obsession and terror. The appearance of this number in Shawshank is like a subtle nod to those who follow his entire universe. I like these kinds of details because they do not force anyone to understand. But if you realize it, it creates the feeling like you are being shared a small secret. Are you the type of person who likes to hunt for Easter eggs in movies? Or do you just want to enjoy the story in the simplest way? 20. The classic line was not in the original script for Red. There are lines in movies that not only end a scene, but also live on in the real lives of the audience. Get busy living, or get busy dying is one of them. Initially, this quote was only written for the character Andy. It is how he views the world after everything he has been through. But Frank Darabont decided to let Red repeat it at the end of the film, in the moment he stood before a true turning point of his life. That small change created a huge emotional effect. It is like Andy not only saved Red physically, but also gave him a new way of thinking about life. I think this is why that quote transcended the movie. It no longer belongs to one character, but becomes a choice that each of us can face. Have you ever encountered a movie quote that you carry with you for many years? It is crazy, right, guys? Sometimes, magic does not only lie on the screen, but it is also present right behind the lens. Movies are not just movies, they are blood, sweat, accidental happenings, and even struggles to create a legacy. What do you think about these secrets? Which detail makes you exclaim, "Unbelievable"? And if you could choose a friend to break out of prison with, or simply go drink beer on the beach of Zihuatanejo, would you choose Andy or Red? Please leave a comment below, I really want to read your thoughts. Do not forget to like and wait for the next movie where we will strip bare the behind the scenes. For now, get busy living, guys. See you again.